Bonjour tout le monde, good afternoon. Chers étudiantes, chers étudiants, chers collègues, chers membres du personnel administratif, distingués invités, mesdames et messieurs, bon après-midi tout le monde. Mon nom est Marcel Mérette et au nom de la Faculté des sciences sociales, je suis très heureux de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cet autre événement spectaculaire, iVote-jeVote. At the Faculty of Social Sciences, we strive to make sure we provide to our students a training that will help them to be engaged in their community and to become the leaders of tomorrow. To meet this objective, we believe that it is important to offer to our students significant experiential learning opportunities. The iVote-jeVote movement, events like tonight, represent exactly that. I recall that this is a movement driven by students with the objective of increasing the vote of young generation in the next and future elections and hence improving our democratic system. This is a good example indeed of engagement among our students. I'm sure that with the discussion tonight on science and public policy and decision making, we will improve our understanding of this important issue for the future of Canada. I conclude by thanking sincerely our panelists tonight and our keynote speaker. Without them, we won't be able to offer such a quality of event. I also want to thank sincerely the Jean-Luc Pepin Research Chair, which support and encourage the iVote-jeVote movement. And now turn over to the moderator, who is, by the way, the chairholder of the Jean-Luc Pepin Research Chair. Please welcome Kevin Page.
Hello, everybody. Are we ready? Does this not look like Thunderdome? It's a privilege to have such a distinguished panelist, practitioners and researchers here with us today. La revue Maclean's a publié un article cette semaine qui souligne les difficultés et les répercussions des cours d'un manque de collecte de données par le gouvernement fédéral. Quelle est la place de la science et la preuve dans le développement des politiques publiques et dans la prise des décisions au Canada? So during today's discussions, we will explore whether scientific evidence derives public policy and if access and transparency in government scientific evidence has changed. How should science and evidence be applied to public policy and decision-making? Il me fait plaisir de vous présenter nos panélistes aujourd'hui. I'm going to introduce you to the four panelists and one of our commentators. But I'm going to start, I'm going to introduce Jeremy Curry. He's a professor at the professor of biology at the University of Ottawa. He's going to help me today with the moderation. Professor Kerr.
He's there. Right in front of you.
How easy is that? Paul Dufour. When I asked him, how should I introduce you, Paul? He said, just some science old guy. He said, is a fellow and adjunct professor with the Institute of Science, Society, and Policy at the University of Ottawa. Paul Dufour. Doesn't look any older than me. Debbie Daviau. Debbie is the 52nd president of the Professional Institute of Public Service of Canada, PIPSI, on January 1st, 2014, represents about 20,000 researchers and scientists. Debbie. My first boss in the public service, I'm very proud to say, Muner Sheikh. Most people, you know him as our chief statistician. Got into a little bit of an issue with something called the long-form census. Now the executive fellow at the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary. He's done much work. My first boss in the public service, Dr. Muner Sheikh. Now a man I can barely recognize, even though I have coffee with him just about every other day, but I've never seen him in a suit and tie. the Associate Professor in the Department of Biology, a member of the Institute of Science, Society, and Policy, and the Director of Graduate Programs at the Institute of the Environment. He's also the co-founder of Evidence for Democracy. Scott Finlay. Dr. Kerr, Jeremy Kerr, assumera le rôle de commentateur. Nous invitons nos panélistes à répondre en anglais ou en français ou dans les deux langues aux questions de M. Kerr or moi. So panelists are welcome to answer questions in English and French. And you know, just in the lead up to this, we were speaking in the room upstairs, and I think what we heard from the panelists is that they want to engage. They want to be engaged by you. So they want to hear from you. We want questions and answers from the audience. So we're going to open this up. I'm going to ask each panelist to speak for about 7 minutes, and you know they're going to all have a little take because they come from a little, you know, a different background, and we will then, you know, we'll get a brief presentation, a few comments from Dr. Kerr, and then we're going to open it up to Q's and A's from the audience. So here we go, Paul.
Whoa, sorry about that. Apologies. Bonjour, buongiorno, buenas tardes. Nice to see everybody here and up there. Hello up there. I'm going to give you a sort of a background intro, given my experience on science culture and science literacy, and why it's such an important dimension to what we're going to be talking about on this panel. By the way, most of you should know it is Science Literacy Week. Everybody know that? Good. So I'm going to give you an overview of, real quick, of some of the experiments that we've been dealing with over the past 30 years. That's how old I am, working in this business. And I'll give you a series of suggestions towards the end of my 7 minutes on where I think we should be going and thinking about for this next election and beyond, of course, because we are celebrating a very special event in 2017, right? 150th anniversary of Canada, and science is part of our culture. It's been part of building Canada. It's a nation-building exercise, and we should be thinking about that as well. So let me just flip to the, sorry. There we go. Okay, so when we're talking about science culture and science literacy, all governments, irrespective of their stripe, pay attention to this subject. And this is just a list of various strategies, approaches that the Government of Canada has experimented with over the last X number of years. And all of them, without exception, address the question of how do we improve science, culture, education, and literacy in our society. The emphasis for each of those listed strategies, of course, are a bit different from political party to political party. I'll talk a little bit about that. Part of the science culture exercise is also understanding that the way in which we gather, disseminate, and use evidence and knowledge in our decision-making structures also is an important feature of the science culture. And at the highest level, i.e. within our elected representatives' governments that we have elected that were in the past and currently, science advice and the use of the evidence to help inform decision-making is critical. And what you have here on this next slide, and I'm sorry for the people up there that can't see this, but these are the experiments we've attempted over the last 50 years, starting with Pearson, Science Council of Canada, Mulroney, an advisory board on science and technology, Monsieur Chrétien, an advisory council on science, Monsieur Martin, who had his own science advisor, Dr. Arthur Carty. Full disclosure, I worked with Dr. Carty in that office. It was an interesting experiment. And the Science, Technology, and Innovation Council, which we currently have under Prime Minister Harper. One of the interesting things about the organizational architecture of science advice in this country is we never learn from our mistakes. We never build on lessons learned from what's worked and what's not worked. So what we do is we kill off organizations in one way or another. We don't learn, but we create new ones, and we start again. And this has been going on now for about 50 years, and I think my personal view is I think we need to step back and start looking at what that organizational ecology of science, advice, and evidence in our governments should look like. Incidentally, in the 1990s, late 90s, under M. Chrétien, there was a body called the Council of Science and Technology Advisors. It looked at the internal use of scientific advice within government, departments, and agencies. Essentially, the council was made up of chief scientists. I'll use that term loosely. Chief scientists in every department and agency. And the idea was to create a kind of a framework around decision-making that could help the government. And I ask you to read this very interesting statement from that framework, which was made a cabinet directive within the government and was followed by all departments and agencies on how you should use, adopt, respect the advice you're getting from your own research and knowledge community. By the way, when I say science advice, I also include traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge and science are very important to this whole discussion, and we should always keep that in mind. So, I'm just going to quickly give you an agenda, a small manifesto of things we should think about when we're talking about what the next steps could be, should be, might be around this issue. First of all, I think we need to have a structure that allows for science advice that's made public. The information is accessible. We can use social media on a regular basis. And we need to think about creating a new advisory council, learning from our past mistakes, that's open, transparent. The current council does not publish its advice. It's not available to the public. The council to the Government of Canada right now. That is not a healthy thing for our democracy, in my view, and I think we need to do something about that. We also need to think about tapping into the youth organizations and agencies that are promoting science and science advocacy, some of whom are here today. Incidentally, for those of you who haven't signed up, there's a University of Ottawa Science Policy Society Club for undergraduate students. So have a look at the website, the University of Ottawa Institute for Science, Society, and Policy, and you'll see how to participate in that. We should be getting Parliament more engaged. Parliament's been eroded in many ways. Some people have been talking about a parliamentary science officer. Let's talk about that. We should be dealing with a clearinghouse, setting up a clearinghouse for scientific information available to all, a portal, so to speak. We could ensure that research community departments and so on take those responsibilities quite seriously in terms of disseminating that information, communicating the results of their information. We should support independent organizations that are moving this agenda forward on evidence-based knowledge and science. And finally, we should think about developing alliances with other like-minded organizations globally. This is a global movement that's been created. In France, it's Sauvons la recherche. In the UK, it's Science is Vital. So there are a lot of groups that are Union Concerned Scientists in the United States. A lot of groups are involved in this, and I think we should build on that and develop kind of alliances. So evidence can come to the rescue with a properly defined architecture, and I think we need to think about how we could do that. For those of you who have seen the current measles debate, for example, or the argument about science and autism and the vaccines. I would just try to close by saying that there is a very interesting development that took place when President Obama took over in the United States on this issue. He actually issued a memorandum to all departments and agencies of the Federal Public Service saying that we need to put science back in its rightful place within our decision-making structure. And this memorandum talked about being able to have scientists not just publish the results, but speak about the results in the media and not be hampered with various impediments, shall we say, to speaking about their results. So this scientific integrity issue is a critical one. And finally, I want to say that next week, just a heads up, next week there will be a release of a media package of a group that's been engaged for the last year and a half on developing a series of principles on scientific integrity, which builds a bit on what I just referred to in the Obama administration, but also on what this Council of Science and Technology Advisors did in the 1990s. So stay tuned. There's a series of principles on how we can use evidence in our decision-making structures, but also, more importantly, have transparency and accountability built in so that the public can access and use this through their regular channels, organizations, social media, etc. So I'll stop there. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Président.
Debbie.
Hi, thank you very much. I want to start by saying what a true honor it is to be sharing the stage with this gang of folks. I never really thought I'd find myself as one of the leaders for science in this country, but representing 50,000 or so federal public servants finds me in a position to become more and more an expert in the defense of public science and science policy. It's especially a pleasure to participate with Kevin Page and his group here at the university trying to get the vote out. Kevin doesn't know this, but I actually have a crush on his big brain, so I'm nervous just to be here next to him. So as I said, the Professional Institute represents about 50,000 federal public servants, about 20,000 of whom are federal scientists and researchers working in many fields right across the government. Whether it be regulatory processes, environmental scientists, protection of transportation of dangerous goods, protection of the environment. They're all engaged in science and research that should be contributing to good policy making and certainly contributing to solving some of these critical global and domestic problems that we're seeing, that we're facing as Canadians. And our members are, or at least they should be, involved in the process of science policy at many different stages, at the front end where they're providing the inputs, the data, the information that should be considered in the development of policy, and at the back end in the application and the enforcement of the policies and regulations. Once they come into play, our members are deeply involved in this area. Unfortunately, for all of us as Canadians over the past several years, my members' ability to perform that work has been seriously deteriorated. And for many of them, there has been this terribly disillusioning process around science policy that we felt we had to take some drastic steps to look after. And because of their profound expertise and commitment to the programs that they deliver, they have been managing to, despite all of these barriers, continue to deliver with less and less resources, more and more burden, less and less respect, resources, libraries disappearing, people whose research over a period of 25 years simply doesn't exist anymore. It makes it more and more difficult for the people in this country who actually do set policy, which aren't my members, if they don't have the evidence that we produce. And I think it's fair to say that Canadians do find this trend worrying. I mean, you probably started to hear about it back in 2007, but it has continually gotten worse. More and more elimination of resources, more and more cuts to what they called the back office. They neglected to tell you that that science and research was now a back office function, that the creation of evidence was less important somehow than these front-facing services to Canadians. And while we had our suspicions of the problem back then, we thought no point in being rhetorical and ideology about our advocacy for Canadian public science. We better get the facts straight. And so we went out to our members. We surveyed all of our science and research members. I guess our first clue to there was a really big problem was the rate of return on this particular survey. So we surveyed about 15,000 federal public scientists and researchers. Well over 5,000 responded, which was an extremely high rate of return on a voluntary survey. And what we heard from our members was truly a stunning indictment on the state of science in the federal government. And it put the spotlight in some very troubling ways in which the public policy process was being put at risk as a result of these changes to science. And so the survey unearthed plenty of evidence, most of it sickening, but I will just cover off a few of the pieces of information that I find are most pertinent to our conversation today. Because we already understood that muzzling was a problem, but when we spoke to our members, we learned that this problem was well beyond not being able to speak to the media. It went to not being able to attend conferences, not being able to speak or share research with your peers. You know, you probably, many of you heard about Stephen Campana, a world-renowned shark expert who was denied access to attend conferences and to exchange with his peers in a field where it's literally one deep. So Stephen Campana was the only shark expert in Canada who finally became so frustrated with his ability to be able to deliver on his program that he packed up his science and he went to Iceland. Stephen Campana is not alone. He was maybe one that didn't go as quietly as some of the others, but there are many, many experts that have left government because they feel they no longer have the capacity to serve Canadians in the way that they always have. So, you know, the picture that our scientists painted was one where evidence was increasingly being bypassed, where the products of their work was being excluded from the public policy process. Less than a quarter of government scientists told us that they were actually satisfied with the use of evidence in the policy-making process. And so this was back in 2012 when we first started to get this survey out, to get this survey data back. And they weren't nearly as upset back then as they are today in 2015 when we've seen the destruction, literally the destruction, the burning of books in 20 or so libraries across the country, in places like Rimouski, where they have the only French oceanic research center in North America. Libraries burn. I'm running out of time, so very quickly, you know, a quarter of scientists had actually been asked to exclude scientific data from their reports for non-scientific reasons. Half, or more than half, said that their ability to access the information they needed had been compromised, and 85% of them felt that their ability to do their work since 2008 had been severely compromised. This is just coming from the people doing this work. So the cuts affected key science divisions right across the country, from transport of dangerous goods to consumer safety to veterinarian drugs to drugs for people, aquatic ecosystems management, and so much more of this research that has literally disappeared. And at the same time, our scientists, so committed to their programs, are doing everything they can to continue to deliver, but finding more and more that capacity no longer exists. And so, as I say, feeling like they've been left with no choice whatsoever but to take some pretty drastic steps. And for us, that was twofold. Number one, we brought bargaining demands to the bargaining table. Instead of going there with wage increases and more vacation and all the things that unions normally go to fight for on behalf of their members, those were not the things that our scientists were interested in. We went to the table with the ability to to attend conferences, with the ability to speak freely about their work, with reinvestment of monies that are generated through scientific innovation in government back into those programs that are generating them. So that was on the one front, at the bargaining table, sort of a premier tactic, if you will, right around the world, taking our scientific integrity to the bargaining table to protect science for those of you guys, for future generations of scientists. And secondly, we got really active, engaged in being politically active in this election. We are still nonpartisan. We are a professional organization representing professionals in the federal public sector for obvious reasons. Our membership is spread right across the board in terms of who they support, except I think we can safely say that the vast majority of federal public servants can no longer support this current government, and they're going to be voting for change on October the 19th. And they're going to be voting for change. Yeah. Because they're going to vote for change because Canadians deserve a government that has the facts and is prepared to face them when it comes to making important and critical policy on behalf of Canadians, whether it's with public safety, public health, inequality, climate change, or innovation, or economic growth. None of these things should ever be considered without the facts, and currently today they all are. So on October the 19th, they especially don't want you guys out voting because you might very well not vote for the incumbent party, and so I urge you to make them pay for not wanting you to get out there by getting out there in droves and casting your vote on October the 19th. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Mr. Debbie Davio. Thank you, Debbie. Munir Sheikh.
Let me first of all thank Kevin for giving me the opportunity to come here and speak to the future of Canada. You are the future of Canada, and I'm quite honored to be here. The second thing that I want to mention, repeating what Kevin said earlier, I was his first boss in the public service. And when I look back at all of the people I've hired, I would say that I'm really proud to having hired Kevin. That is the way a public servant is supposed to be, and you see it right in front of you. Now, those of you who have known me and seen me would have noticed that I look quite different compared to the way I used to look about a month ago, at the time when the Prime Minister called for the election. And the reason I look so different is that, having listened to the debates, I've been pulling my hair, and most of it is gone. With the remaining debates that are still to come, we have one more month to go. I have no doubt in my mind that on October the 19th, I look exactly like Kevin. I have a presentation on evidence-based policy development, and you won't see the word science anywhere. I'm not a scientist in the traditional sense of the word, so I'm going to focus on evidence. And in focusing on evidence, I hope I can make it work. Okay, evidence is serious business. Everybody is in support of using evidence in decision-making or policy development. For me, the use of evidence means three things. We must begin with a clear hypothesis. We must then use evidence for policy analysis. And then again, we must use evidence for optimal policy development. That is the sequence in which you use evidence for decision-making. And I want to very clearly distinguish between evidence-based decision-making and decision-based evidence-making, which is what you see most often. And I'm sure you know what leadership is, so I'm not really going to be talking about it in the short amount of time that we have. I have developed a bit of a framework that I find very useful to analyze public policies for myself, so I thought I'll share that with you, and you may find that useful to some extent. I have this little picture where I have leadership, one of the two variables on the top, and then I have evidence on the side, and of course that gives you 4 quadrants. On the extreme left of this chart means that you need pretty strong leadership to act on some policies. On the extreme right, where you see 0, it's really something easy to do. And of course, it is a continuum. It's not a binary situation. And the same thing on evidence. At the top, you have strong evidence in support of some policy. At the bottom, you have 0 evidence in support of some policy. So with these 4 possibilities, what is it that I would expect on the state of public policy? This is what I would expect. On the left side quadrant, we have good public policies, but pretty hard to implement. On the right-hand top quadrant, easy to implement, but good public policies. And of course, at the bottom left side, we have bad public policies, and they're really hard to implement bad public policies. And of course, the fourth is a combination of easy to implement and bad public policies. So based on this distribution of policies, what is my expectations as to what would actually happen in reality? This is what I would expect. A few really good public policies because they're so hard to implement. Many good public policies that are easy to implement. No public policy which is really hard to implement and is terrible policy to start with. I don't expect to see that. And there'll be some public policies which are bad public policies. They're easy to implement. I mean, we are talking about politicians here, right? What do we actually see? This is my description of public policies. Yours may be different, but this is what I saw. On the hard and good public policies, you look back in history and you see quite a few. The implementation of the GST, price stability, reform of the Canada-Quebec pension plan, the elimination of deficit in 1997, the free trade agreement, not an exhaustive list, but quite a few examples. On the right-hand side, remember, these are easy policies to do. They require a little bit of political leadership, not a hell of a lot. And you see infrastructure, the carbon tax, the social assistance programs, extended health benefits to include drugs, dental vision. On the left-hand side, at the bottom, you see 2 things where the government went out of their way to provide leadership and implemented policies which are exactly terrible policies. Long-form census and the refugee healthcare program, where we end up spending more money for worse outcomes. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, you have these policies which are easy and bad, cap and trade, income splitting, GST cuts when the government took over, and the elimination of balanced budget in 2015. So what is my reaction to this? I'm very surprised at how many policies there are that are good. Very surprised that the government would not implement easy policies that are really good policies. Shocked at the bad policies with so much political capital spent. And of course, what can you say about politicians? So in conclusion, let me say 2 things. The use of evidence in decision-making is extremely important, but please beware of decision-based evidence-making compared to evidence-based decision-making. And as my colleague said, for God's sake, go and vote. You can do more in getting science being used than we ever can. Thank you.
Thank you, Miner. Miner Sheikh, Scott Finley.
Hello. I think that I will confine my remarks to some comments about why I'm a scientist, first of all. I'm an educator also, and I'd like to just give you a little bit of a flavor for why I personally have become so involved in this issue over the last little while. And those comments take the form of actually 3 arguments. And those are arguments that strike to my core, A, as a scientist, and B, as an educator. So the first argument has to do with two things that I embrace and value highly: science and democracy. And the argument goes like this. True democracy depends on an informed public. This was a point made by Thomas Jefferson, the architect of the American Constitution, and he was absolutely right. That's premise number one. Premise number two is that knowledge that creates the informed public, science generates that. There is, of course, knowledge that goes above, transcends science, and there are critical questions to which science cannot speak. But nonetheless, a fair amount of knowledge is a consequence of science. And if you put those two premises together, you're left with the inevitable, i.e. deductive conclusion, that true democracy depends on science. That's argument number one. The second argument speaks to the second institution that I'm very much involved in here at the university. It's part of the reason why I became a university professor: education. Thomas Jefferson again noted that the principal directive of government, the first objective of government, is to educate. And I agree 100%. That is the prime objective of government, is to educate. Education requires the sharing of information. That's critical. Thirdly, scientific information is a particular type of information, not the only type of information, but a very important part. If you put those three premises together, you're left with the conclusion that therefore governments have a responsibility to share scientific information. The third argument has to do with the type of science. Governments, at least democratic governments, should be concerned first and foremost with the public interest. That's premise number one. Second premise, corporate interest is not necessarily the public interest. There are all sorts of cases where corporate interest and the public interest overlap, but one need not necessarily imply the other. The third premise is that corporate science serves corporate interests, first and foremost, not necessarily exclusively. If you put those three things together, you're left with the inevitable conclusion, in my view, that governments must support and uphold non-corporate science. So, those are the three arguments, and of course I'm a university professor, so we're very big on arguments. But those are the three arguments that have led me inevitably to the conclusion that both democracy and the public interest depend critically on the conduct and the communication of public interest science. So, this event has been organized by Kevin, consistent with the idea that we want to encourage people to get out and vote, particularly young people to get out and vote. And so if you buy those arguments that I've just given you, and you need not, but if you do, there are an obvious set of questions that you should be asking of all candidates, irrespective of their political stripe. What is it that you, and by extension your party, are going to do to support the conduct and the communication of public interest science? And for me, as a scientist and an educator, that's a question of pressing concern. And I find it remarkable, to follow up on Munir's comments, I find it remarkable that I listened to 2 hours last Thursday of at times anesthetizing debate on the economy, and the word science was not mentioned once. remarkable. There's a message there. So I would just conclude by saying that question, how are you as a candidate in a party going to support public interest science, both the conduct and the communication of it, is a question that anybody who's concerned about A, democracy, B, the public interest should be asking. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So I'm going to ask Dr. Kerr, Jeremy Kerr, Professor of Biology at the University of Ottawa, just to get the questions going, to give us some additional food for thought that brings some of these ideas together. And then please get your questions ready. Thank you very much.
Okay, so hopefully everybody can hear me. Thank you very much for coming out this evening. I think it's a very positive sign that we have such an extraordinary turnout for a discussion around the use of evidence in decision-making at a policy level, and the idea that we can have this discussion and have a lot of people actually turn up to this theme and talk about this theme is a remarkable thing. And the fact is, you guys go up 5 flights of stairs. It's truly impressive, and I'll tell you right now, my lecture theaters. My lecture theaters are never this packed, so I know immediately that you're not here to see me, but in fact our extraordinary panel who's provided such a great array of discussion points that I hope will kick off some really good questions for you. But I'd also like to thank our moderator, Kevin Page, whose extraordinary contributions as parliamentary budget officer set an example that I think we can all hold up and applaud. So I want to take my prerogative as a discussant in this evening's events to quickly move on to a question or two to kind of grease the wheels, but then I really want to hear from you guys, and we'll start looking for people to put their hands up and ask some questions. So one of the things I'd like to put to the panel, and you guys can decide how you'd like to respond and who would like to take the lead in those responses, I might say that we have arguably reached a point now with discussions around roles of evidence in decision-making in Canada, where the problems are now so serious and arise from such a clearly defined end of the political spectrum that even having a discussion like we are doing this evening is implicitly a partisan political activity. How did we get to the point where using broadly based evidence to inform decision-making that affects Canadians' health, their environments, and their prosperity, how do we get to the point where those kinds of decisions, informed by evidence, might be viewed as a partisan act?
I'll go there. I'll go there. I'll shoot off the hip on this one. First of all, PIPS is a non-partisan organization, so we believe that the work of our scientists around this election is in fact non-partisan. Non-partisan means for us examining the evidence, making sure that the information is shared freely, and getting it into the hands of the people who matter most. And it also means that as Canadian citizens, when we're not being public servants, we have the right to speak out freely. Unfortunately, this government doesn't share that view, so I wanted an opportunity to highlight our member Tony Turner, who was the author and performer of Harper Man. Has anyone seen Harper Man? So Tony is fighting for his job as a result of having written a folk song, because somehow that creates a conflict with his work on migratory birds. And I thought it really interesting, because one of the more conservative outlets that I did an interview with, by the way, even the conservative outlets are sensitized now to the issue of scientists, but the conservative outlet who had said to me, Aren't you worried that, well, you know, this guy now, let's say he goes to give some policy advice to his deputy minister, and he's done this song against the government, they might not take him seriously. And I said, well, that's now the very definition of hyper-partisanship. Our members aren't offering up their opinion. They're offering up facts and evidence. It's up to somebody else to make policy on that evidence. And this government, unfortunately, finds evidence highly inconvenient. And that's how we got to this place. The evidence doesn't support their ideology. So they're eliminating the evidence, because otherwise, how can they possibly tell the story of the many reasons why they're right if the evidence says otherwise?
Can I wade in there, Jeremy? Debbie has advanced an interesting hypothesis to explain why we've come to the point where the use or non-use or misuse of evidence has become a partisan issue. But there's of course, a whole range of hypotheses, but one is that it actually goes much deeper. And it's not first and foremost about evidence. It's simply a reflection of the fact that, unfortunately, and I think this is to the detriment of us all, that we now live in a political climate that is hyper partisan. That you simply cannot make a statement without it being spun into some sort of partisan overtone. This is not only non-productive, it's actually counterproductive. And my view is that the evidence issue is just symptomatic of a more profound and pervasive disease that because everything has become hyper-partisanized, this is the consequence. It's an inevitable consequence of that hyper-partisanization, if there is indeed such a verb. So it may actually have nothing to do with evidence. Evidence may simply be the symptom of a greater ill.
Well, let me remind people of the political process that we must follow in a democratic system like Canada's. All of us elect the government that we want, and it really is our responsibility to vote appropriately to make sure that the decisions a government makes are appropriate decisions. For the public service, at the most senior level, there are two responsibilities that they must always keep in mind. The first responsibility is that they give the very best policy advice to whatever government you elect. And the second responsibility they have is to ensure that whatever decisions that government makes, which you elect, that those decisions are implemented. So just to go out and keep blaming the government for not following science, you should actually be blaming yourself, that if you have given the responsibility for that to someone who doesn't take science seriously. So look at yourself and see whether or not you're voting properly. So that's the first issue that you need to keep in mind. The second issue that you need to keep in mind is whether or not our senior public servants are doing the job they're supposed to be doing. I really, honestly, think it's a sad day in Canada when people like Kevin Page and Munir Sheikh are singled out for what they have done, because every public servant must be doing the same thing. And the fact that we're being singled out simply means they're not doing it. So I think if you want to blame somebody for the state that we are in, it is our senior public service, not the politicians.
But it's also what makes both Kevin Page and Munir Sheikh, amongst a handful of others, the heroes of professional public servants who really just want to be able to do a good job. So.
this is not rocket surgery, as somebody once said. You know, the notion, and I'm sorry, I'm tempted to go into a little riff here on the National Science Advisor, who was also, whose position in the office was eliminated, but I won't go into that sad saga. But let me just remind people here that in the late 1990s, the government of Canada was facing a series of controversies around how it was handling quote-unquote evidence and science within its own public service. That had to do with the blood inquiry on tainted blood, cod, fishery stock, and so on, health issues associated with pharma. And the government made a choice, right, at the time. The choice was, well, we'll ignore it, we'll clamp down, we'll forget about it, and it'll go away. Or we'll try to address the situation and create something that will try to address it constructively. And so what did they do? They came up with this framework that I mentioned to you earlier about decision-making, and that we will try to develop an integrity set of principles for our federal public servants when we use science. And we do want to listen to what the scientific community has to say, this because we understand that this issue is so important to our society, our culture, and our economy that it needs to be addressed. So you always have a choice. There's always a choice in public policy. And the question is whether you want to take path A or path B, or as Yogi Berra used to say, when you reach a fork in the road, take it, right? So, I mean, these are the choices that the public policy apparatus has to make. So I just wanted to remind people about that. Thank you.
This would be a wonderful opportunity for us to have questions from the floor. We have microphones that are set up on the floor, and if you'd like to ask some questions, please join in. We need to hear from you and have the panelists give them a chance to respond. And folks upstairs, if you want to come jogging down, or send paper airplanes our way, we're used to it anyway, with questions on them, we will be very happy to hear them. Yes, please.
A lot of you talk about our generation. I don't know, I just think that we have a lot of things to start to reveal. And I just don't know where to start. I know you would probably say not to vote for Harper. I won't. But where to start and how to get him out of the power that he doesn't deserve. And I don't know, is it to change the way of voting? Like, where like a lot of country in Europe have, like where each vote counts.
I think that's part of it. Certainly getting to a more proportional representative system is probably part of it, but actually I think certainly why I'm here, despite the fact that I'm a grandma now, and why I'm bothering to reach out to students and thinking that I might actually make a difference with young people. I have children your age, but the reason I'm here is because it's you people that are going to make the difference, because statistically, when new voters go out and vote, when we increase the numbers of people out at the polls who wouldn't have normally voted, that promotes change. And so you actually see an entire movement, whether it be the labor movement or science advocacy groups or veterans groups or you name it, just trying to push out new votes. And you guys are key when it comes to new votes. New votes make a difference. Old votes, just more of the same. And where to start? Obviously, we're trying to put out the information we need to put out. We've asked some very serious questions around science and science policy of parties in this particular election because of who we represent. All of our information is being posted on the public part of our website at www.pipsc.ca. I do invite you to go there. There's a whole election toolkit with the questions that we're asking candidates coming door to door, which are really not just focused on science, but public policy in general and public service in general. Several of them focused around science. By all means, take whatever we've got, make it yours, make use of it. Get in touch with me and ask questions if you need more. There are sites out there that are mapping government's policies around particular fundamental issues. I think science is going to find its way there. Parties are all making public statements now on their platforms around science. So I do encourage you to inform and educate yourself in whatever way you can. And I'll tell you what I'm telling my members who I refuse to tell who exactly to vote for. Vote with your heart and your head, and I'm hoping they'll lead you to the same place because you are educated, informed people. Thank you.
How do we switch on the mic?
Okay.
Just go. You're live.
Thank you. The question is, you often hear about this notion that ultimately elections, people vote based on kitchen table issues. The question is then, how would science become a kitchen table issue?
Well, while they're thinking of an answer, I'll say I think that's what we've all been concerning ourselves with. So we actually started ourselves in about 2010 when we started putting together these surveys to get the facts that we needed, because by 2010 we already knew science had taken a turn for the worst. So building up the facts and evidence that you need to make a proper and credible case. But obviously, as we've seen through this government, it takes more than that. It takes how you communicate and how you engage with a broad group of people to actually make a change and make a difference. And so we've done everything from teaching our people how to speak about these issues to teaching them which parts of their communities they can properly engage with to make this difference. But quite honestly, I think we're all concerned with exactly that question, and this is just one of the many things that we're doing to make that difference. Scott, are you ready to speak now? You looked like I saw some smoke coming out.
Actually, there's a pretty simple answer to that. We all eat. We all have kitchen tables. I'm sure you sit down with other people to eat meals together. Why doesn't every one of you make sure that you talk to others while you are sitting at the kitchen table? I mean, it is our responsibility to ensure that this actually does become an issue that gets discussed, and there's no reason why we all can't do it.
Working yet? There you go. Oh, how about that? I wanted to ask a question about, because it's been my observation over quite a while that communication management is a huge feature of modern political management in Canada. And I would argue that that's really the thing that's prohibiting both the democracy, appropriate functioning of democracy and appropriate functioning of science. So we've seen communication management just get elevated and elevated to the point where you now have, over 100 staffers in the PMO. I mean, how did that happen? And basically no minister of the Crown can actually talk without basically permission to go off leash from the PMO. So to what degree, and that has been a long time coming, I'm in around a while, that's been coming for 25, 30 years, a slow progression, and maybe it's gone to another level, the current government. But how do you ever work against that? Because that's just something that's happened. There's a lot of players in that, including the media, including how the public consumes sound bites, etc. So how do we go return that tide back? Because communication management, in my mind, is a huge stumbling block.
Perhaps I can take a shot at that. I think you're absolutely right. I think that this ultra hyper communication management does militate against the kinds of issues that we would like to see put forward. But there's a reason that that's become the world in which we live, right? And I think that reason, this is my hypothesis, I am after all a scientist, The reason is because for some reason or other, we, the public, has become completely intolerant of mistakes. And so if the public has become completely intolerant of errors, then the worst thing that you can do politically is make a mistake or admit to it. And if the worst thing you can do is make a mistake or admit to it, the inevitable consequence of that is hyper-communications management. The machinery of government has become completely risk-averse. And there's this old adage that a man, it's an antiquated adage, so it refers to men only, but the same applies to women. The man or woman who can't make a mistake can't make anything. And I think that evolution of this hyper-management is a consequence of the lack of tolerance on the public's part in making an error. And yet everybody in this room makes errors all the time. And so I think if the public were more forgiving about errors, of course we make errors. The key is if you repeat them, right? I think if the public became more tolerant of errors, that would reverse this tide, this trend, because the political machinery is not stupid. They're doing it because it works. Why does it work? Because of our attitudes. That's the way, in my view, this is my hypothesis. So, how would we reverse that trend to become a bit more tolerant? Thank you.
Just to say that I think that might be part of the problem for sure, that in this 24/7 news world that it would be really easy to get yourself into trouble if you were actually trying to do something meaningful. Nonetheless, when we surveyed our members, 86% of them, 86%, said they felt they would face censure or retaliation if they spoke out about a departmental decision that could harm public health, safety, or the environment. 86%. So when there's that kind of threat, a muzzle that is so strong that people's very livelihoods are threatened by that muzzle, I think the answer lies in that if you want actually to be able to put out credible information in a 24/7 information world, you actually need to have credible experts doing so. And so long as your experts are completely muzzled, we are never going to get a handle or get the upper edge on the communications front. We're never going to be able to tell the right stories because the people who have the information to tell them aren't allowed to. And so a big part of this is simply taking the muzzle off of the experts who have the research and the information that's real, factual, and is not simply somebody's opinion or ideology.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let me just make an argument here that one of the interesting things that's happened over the last 10, 15 years is we're moving away from the scientifically illiterate and politically clueless kind of argument that's been going back and forth. The scientific community is getting a little more sophisticated with its communication tools. This is a good thing. The political community writ large is trying to come to grips with it, and I think there needs to be a better dialogue between what we used to call the scientifically literate and politically clueless. I think this notion about communicating, you all can communicate, you're all wired, and using social media, I think that's an important dimension to getting out there and making the case for why this is an important election issue. So go to it. Thank you.
So I'd like to invite you to ask a
Hello. Thank you for giving me the privilege of speaking here. This is very interesting. I'd like to go back to the year 1969. There was a very interesting book written entitled Propaganda, the Shaping of Human Attitudes. So it isn't just necessarily the role of propaganda, to inform people, but to shape that very public opinion. So how does the public find a way to talk back to it? It's just one way. It's not dialogue. It's monologue coming from the top. And I see we've got this side show going on for till October the 19th. I wonder who in the hell's robbing the till.
Thank you. Can I jump in there, Jeremy? I think this is a very important point. And I would go back to the attitude issue. You know, knowledge is important, but attitude is all. And I talked a little bit about in my response to the previous comment about fostering one way to reduce or reverse the trend of this communication control is to become a bit more tolerant of error. I think a second attitude that we need to develop, and scientists are at least notionally good at this because it's bred in the bone, and that is to become more skeptical. Right? Science teaches us, or should teach us, to become more skeptical. I'm not convinced that it always does, but it should. And so the way to counteract propaganda is to simply become more skeptical, constructively skeptical, right? So it's not a knee-jerk Pavlovian skepticism where you just don't believe anything you're told, but to ask the question, you know, you say that this is the case. How do we know that? And my view is if the public started to develop and make clear those two attitudes, an attitude of tolerance for error, not limitless tolerance, but some tolerance, more than we have, for error, and secondly, a culture of skepticism, those two things combined, and that's something that everybody in this room could do. Those two things combined, I think, might be effective, or at least that's my hypothesis.
Actually, those who worry about the power of communication coming out of the PMO and propaganda, I have a question for them. My question is, how can 100 people sitting in PMO do more to convince Canadians than everybody else put together? Like, where are the political parties? Where is the media? Why is it that they can't put up the effort to counter what comes out of those 100 people?
Hi there. I'm a fourth-year environmental science student, just finishing my undergrad, and I believe in science, and I love studying science, but I'm very, because, say, the government doesn't really listen to scientists, let's say, and I guess I'm really deterred to go in the field of science because I feel like my opinion, or my work as a scientist, if I become a scientist, won't matter that much. So my question to you guys is like, what's your advice to young scientists to like get into doing science, because it's kind of intimidating and it might be pointless at the end of the day? That's my question.
I think that's the whole point of why we're here. It's because you guys are going to get out there and vote and make a difference in this election. Don't get me wrong. It's not like there's some other government out there who has been particularly overly respectful of federal public services. They're not. They look there for their savings. They look there for their experimental new policy and that sort of thing. It's not the haven under any government. I think the big distinction between this government and every other government that I've seen, and in 1970 I was 2, but every government I've seen at least was open to hearing from its experts, hearing from its scientists, even hearing from the unions that represent those workers in the interest of bettering the capacity of those programs. What seems to be, and I know it's a very negative outlook, but it's real. What seems to be happening now is the government has actually reduced the capacity of government to such an extent that these programs, no matter how committed the people working on them, won't be able to succeed. And so it seems as though you have a government that's just very committed to eliminating public services. And so by disabling those public services, they put themselves in a better position to say, look, now you didn't see them and you didn't hear from them, so they must not matter. And our job is to counter that. And as I say, in fact, I took this from Kevin Page when he came and spoke at one of our events a couple years ago, that this is an election. This election is an opportunity that can't be missed. It is an opportunity to restore the balance on what is reasonable and what is fair and what Canadians need and deserve in order to be healthy and well. And so for me, there's one solution that I'm going to try to effect in the next 28 days. And then beyond that, we've got other solutions, as I say, at the bargaining table and advocating in various areas. But I don't think I could be any more clear that number one solution is make sure you get out and vote, and you vote for the kind of government that you want, because otherwise you're going to face, your generation is going to face exactly what mine did, which is a deteriorating capacity of government and the complete ignorance of scientific facts and evidence. So get out there, cast your ballot, and I can assure you that this is the worst government we've faced so far, and we can only get better.
Let me remind people again that governments come and governments go, and public servants are there for a very long time. What that means to me is that if there is a government which doesn't take science seriously, their negative impact is quite temporary. If, on the other hand, good scientists, as a result of that, don't join the government or the public service, you will be doing permanent damage to the public service of Canada. And so my advice, after giving you first advice, please vote. My second advice to you is, for God's sake, join the public service and make sure that things get done the way they're supposed to be done.
I'm not completely depressed. I think this is, there are many positive signals out there. Come and take my course on science policy and why it matters for young scientists like yourself, and I can help you with that. But more importantly, I think we focus a lot on the federal government, but you can also play a very important role in other public service functions, which includes our local municipalities here, provincial governments, and they're not all in the same category. If you look at what's happening in Quebec right now, for example, they have a chief scientist, they have a research integrity set of guidelines for their own scientific community. I mean, they're trying to, ils ont une culture scientifique qui est très bien développée. Ils ont ACFAS, ils ont plusieurs organismes qui sont là pour la disponibilité des jeunes. Yeah, so all I'm saying is, it's not just the feds that are going to make or break your future. There's other opportunities.
So by all means, everybody, I'm sorry, you're going to...
I just wanted to say the scientists that left government over the past few years because they just couldn't take it anymore because their critical program was simply eliminated, all of them found work in other sectors. So there is lots of meaningful work to be done. From my perspective, some of that work must be public in order for us to come to these good policies. But so science has deteriorated. The quality of scientists in this country has only improved over the past few years.
So let me just say one thing in conclusion. The negative option of not voting takes your voice out of the debate. The idea that there's nothing here at stake for you is clearly wrong. Your voice needs to be heard, and the single best way that you have to exercise your right to participate in the debate is to exercise your right to vote. Understand that the way you vote may have changed. The rules governing where you vote, how you vote, what you need to bring to vote are different than they used to be. You need to be prepared for those new rules. Find out what those rules are and make sure that you're not that unlucky person who turns up at the ballot box only to be sent home without exercising your right to vote. So I'll pass it over to Kevin Page.
J'ai beaucoup d'appréciation pour le débat ce soir. Alors, a big thank you for all our guests today, our panelists, Paul Duvar, Debbie Davio, Nina Sheikh, Scott Finley. So this is a bit of a warm-up. We have a keynote speaker coming up, and I think you've kind of heard of him, Dr. Suzuki. It's going to be amazing. Please stick around.